Imagine a sound that turns the blood in your veins into icy slush, a sound that cannot be confused with anything else. It is the absolute, vacuum-like silence that descended upon a room where laughter had just roared and glasses of expensive bourbon had just clinked. The calendar reads August 14th, 1972. The hands of the clock in the presidential suite of the International Hotel in Las Vegas are frozen at 10 in the evening, and the air here is so oversaturated with electricity that it seems a single careless breath would be enough to blow the entire building sky high. You probably think you are at an ordinary party after a grand show. You're wrong. You are at the epicenter of a collision between two of the greatest worlds of the 20th century. And in this cramped space, permeated with the smell of expensive tobacco and sweat, a question is being decided that no one dared to ask aloud. Who is the true king when the spotlights go out and the music fades? In the center of the room, surrounded by 5 massive men whose faces resemble cliffs, stands a short man in an impeccable black suit. His movements are so fluid, they seem like slow motion, and his gaze pierces through anyone who dares to meet his eyes. This is Bruce Lee. But why are these giants, Elvis Presley's personal security, known as the Memphis Mafia, looking at him not with curiosity, but with that same predatory wariness with which a pack of wolves looks at a leopard that has entered their den? Do you think they fear his fame or his connections? No, their fear is much deeper. It is visceral, almost animalistic. These men are not just bodyguards. They are the elite of American karate at the time. Black belts accustomed to their fists being the final argument in any dispute. But in the presence of Bruce Lee, their confidence began to melt like ice in a glass of whiskey. To understand why a true psychological thriller unfolded behind the scenes in Las Vegas that night, you need to look away from the heroes' faces and feel one detail that in this story will become our dagger and the key to understanding the imminent catastrophe. On a low coffee table, right in front of Elvis, lies a white silk scarf soaked in his sweat and makeup after the performance. Look at it in your imagination. This scarf looks like a white flag thrown into the dust, a symbol that the king of rock and roll is exhausted, drained, and in need of protection. But who in this room actually needs protection? Elvis Presley was obsessed with martial arts. He spent thousands of hours training. He awarded himself high Dan ranks, and his security was his primary confirmation of his power. They created an illusion for him in which he was an invincible master. They let him win during sparring sessions. They whispered to him that his strikes were faster than lightning. And then, into this hermetic room, into this cocoon of lies, enters a man who is the embodiment of pure, distilled reality. The security felt the threat to their authority instantly. If this movie actor from Hong Kong showed Elvis what a real fight was, their cozy world of free limousines, gold watches, and untouchable status would come to an end. They weren't just guarding Elvis's body, they were guarding his belief in his own strength, which was their main source of income. And at that moment, one of the bodyguards, a massive man named Red, stepped forward, breaking all rules of etiquette. "Listen, Lee." His voice sounded like metal scraping against glass, making everyone in the room flinch. "We've heard a lot of fairy tales about your tricks, but in Memphis, we believe in what we can touch with our hands. Your karate looks great on film, but how will it work against 200 pounds of real muscle that isn't planning to fall down according to a script?" That very visual silence descended upon the room, where time seemed to turn into viscous resin. Bruce Lee did not answer. He didn't even turn his head toward Red. He continued to look at Elvis, and in his eyes was reflected that very white silk scarf lying on the table. Bruce understood that this scarf was not just fabric. It was the boundary between myth and truth. And he decided that tonight, that boundary would be erased. Ask yourself honestly, what would you have done in his place? Against you are 5 fighters, armed with experience and mass, backed by the most influential man in the world of music. Any normal person would try to turn it all into a joke or politely leave. But Bruce Lee was not a normal person. He was a predator who sensed weakness in the pack. He slowly shifted his body weight to his lead leg, and this almost imperceptible gesture made the security instinctively tense. Their hands slid under their jackets toward their weapons. But Bruce wasn't going to fight. He was going to do something much more destructive. He was going to show Elvis that his mafia was not a shield, but merely a papier-mâché prop. And in the second, Red raised his massive palm for another dismissive gesture. Bruce Lee made a move that no one saw in time, but which made the hearts of those present skip a beat, because the air in the room suddenly exploded with the realization something is about to happen that will forever change the life of everyone in this dressing room, and there will be no turning back. Are you ready to find out why Bruce Lee didn't hit the bodyguard, and what phrase, whispered by him at that second, made Elvis himself jump off the couch in a cold sweat? The real nightmare for the Memphis Mafia was only beginning. To understand why this moment behind the scenes at the International Hotel became the point of no return for the entire Memphis Mafia, you need to realize one frightening truth that Elvis Presley's biographers keep quiet about. His bodyguards were not just guards. They were his mirrors, reflecting the version of reality the king desperately wanted to believe in. These men, trained in traditional, hard styles of karate, built a world around Elvis where he was always the fastest, the strongest, and the most technical. But Bruce Lee's appearance in that room acted like an electric shock to a man who had slept too long in a warm bath. The security saw Bruce not just as a movie actor. They saw him as a threat to their survival, because Bruce Lee was living proof that everything they taught Elvis was merely a beautiful but useless decoration. In the air, permeated with the smell of hairspray and fear, hung the question no one dared to ask. What would happen to this empire of lies if the king suddenly saw the truth? Red, the senior bodyguard, whose fists were covered in calluses from thousands of strikes on the Makiwara, felt his authority slipping through his fingers with every calm breath Bruce Lee took. He was used to being the apex predator in this dressing room, but now he felt like a clumsy bear before a cobra that hadn't even deigned to take a stance. To regain control of the situation, Red decided to use a tried and tested method, psychological pressure, through mass. He stepped so close to Bruce that only inches separated them, and his massive shadow completely swallowed the master's short frame. "You talk a lot about philosophy, Lee," Red growled, his voice vibrating with suppressed rage. "But philosophy doesn't stop bullets, and it doesn't break bones. Here in Vegas, we only respect what works at 3 in the morning in a dark alley. You seem a bit too fragile for this city to me." And here comes that very Santa Barbara effect that makes your brain freeze in surprise. Bruce Lee did not defend his honor. He didn't try to prove he wasn't fragile. Instead, he made a move that completely disoriented the security. He slowly, almost tenderly, reached out his hand toward that very white silk scarf lying on the table in front of Elvis. Remember our dagger? This scarf was not just an accessory. It was the boundary of the king's personal space. The security instinctively flinched, their hands clenching into fists, ready to crush the head of anyone who dared touch the boss's things. But Bruce didn't touch the scarf. He stopped his hand an inch away from it and looked Red straight in the eye. "This scarf is wet," Bruce said, his voice as quiet as the rustle of leaves. "Your boss is tired. He gave all his strength to the audience. And you are wasting his time puffing out your chest in front of me. Are you protecting his peace or your own ego? Ask yourself honestly, what does a professional bodyguard feel when he is publicly accused of incompetence in front of his employer?" A fire ignited in Red's eyes that could not be extinguished with words. He realized that Bruce Lee had just ripped the mask of the loyal servant off him, exposing a common, vain bouncer. Red could no longer restrain himself. He decided that the only way to silence this philosopher was to show him the difference in weight classes. "Let's test your theory," Red said, and in his voice rang the death sentence for the evening's peace. "Stand in the center. Show us your kung fu. I will throw one punch. If you can block it, I'll apologize. If not, you just walk out of here and never come near Elvis again." The viewer at this moment expects a classic fight to begin. We are used to conflicts being resolved by an exchange of blows, but Bruce Lee prepared something entirely different, something that would turn this sparring match into a psychological execution. He slowly nodded and stepped into the center of the room, clearing the space around him. Elvis Presley, who until that moment had sat motionless, suddenly leaned forward, and his eyes, clouded with fatigue, lit up with feverish interest. He sensed that something was about to happen that he hadn't seen in any karate textbook. Bruce Lee stood opposite the 200-pound giant, but he did not raise his hands. He didn't tense a single muscle. He stood absolutely relaxed, as if inviting Red to throw his best shot. And in that ringing, vacuum-like silence of the dressing room, broken only by the heavy breathing of the security, Bruce uttered the phrase that became the hook for the next act of this drama. "Hit me, Red. But remember, what you see before you is not me. It is merely your idea of where I am." In that same second, Red wound up, putting all his hatred and all his mass into the strike, unaware that he had already lost this fight, and that in 5 seconds, his own confidence would become his greatest enemy. But are you ready to find out why the giant's fist never reached its target, and what invisible force made him collapse to his knees in total silence? The plot twist has already begun. In that very second, when Red's 200-pound fist lunged forward, intending to wipe the arrogant smile off Bruce Lee's face once and for all, the space of that luxurious Las Vegas dressing room suddenly collapsed into a single, ringing vacuum point. That very visual silence occurred, making ears pop and heads spin. The hum of the air conditioners vanished, the clinking of ice in glasses died down, and the only sound in the universe was the dry, predatory whistle of sliced air. You expect to hear a dull thud or the crunch of Bruce's breaking bones? That would be logical, as you can't argue with physics. Red's mass should have crushed the movie actor like an eggshell. But here the Santa Barbara effect kicks in, making your brain stall in surprise. Bruce Lee did not block the strike, and he did not jump back. Instead of running from danger, he did something absolutely insane from any fighter's perspective. He stepped toward the flying fist, entering that very dead zone where the strike had not yet gathered its destructive power. It was the conveyor belt principle in action. One movement that no one had time to realize instantly gave birth to a second. Bruce Lee's right hand, which a moment ago was relaxed, darted up at a speed the human eye is incapable of capturing as a sequence of phases. It was simply a flash. You wouldn't have seen the catch. You would have only seen the result. Red's fist, a projectile weighing several tons of inertia, suddenly froze 4 inches from Bruce's shoulder, as if hitting an invisible wall. But it wasn't a wall. It was Bruce's fingers, which had closed on the giant's radial nerve with the precision and force of a steel trap. Red opened his mouth to let out a victory cry, but instead a strange, stifled rasp escaped his chest, the sound of a man who suddenly realized that his own arm no longer belonged to him. Ask yourself honestly, what does a professional killer feel when his primary weapon turns into a source of blinding, paralyzing pain in a single second? Red felt a discharge pass through his arm, comparable to a 220-volt electric shock. His fingers unclenched on their own, the will to attack evaporated, replaced by primal terror. Bruce Lee wasn't just holding him. He was using Red's own inertia to turn his mass into his own executioner. The master slightly turned the giant's wrist counterclockwise, and this microscopic turn forced the 200-pound body of the bodyguard to begin its relentless descent to the floor. It was a moment of intellectual orgasm for anyone who understands biomechanics. Bruce wasn't fighting Red's muscles. He was fighting his skeleton, using the opponent's joints as levers for his own destruction. But the most incredible thing was happening not in the center of the room, but on the coffee table where our dagger lay, that very white silk scarf of Elvis's. Look at it in your imagination, carefully. In any fight, in any chaotic collision, the air in the room begins to vibrate, objects fall, light fabrics fly from sudden movements. But this scarf, it didn't even budge. It remained lying in the same position Elvis had thrown it. Do you understand what that means? Bruce Lee moved so perfectly, his control over space was so absolute, that he didn't create a single unnecessary air vortex. He was destroying the enemy inside a storm while remaining the calm itself. The scarf was the litmus test of his beyond limit mastery. While Red fell, crushing the room's silence with his weight, Bruce remained in a state of rest that was more frightening than any aggression. Red collapsed onto one knee. His face, which a minute ago was red with rage, had now turned ashen gray, and cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He stared at the floor, unable to raise his head, because Bruce Lee's hand, still holding his wrist, dictated a new reality to him. A reality in which he was not the king's protector, but a helpless victim. The other 4 bodyguards froze against the walls, their hands stalled under their jackets on the grips of their revolvers, but they didn't dare draw them. They understood. If they took even one step, this man in the black suit would finish what he started faster than they could pull the trigger. A silence fell over the dressing room, in which only the heavy, ragged breathing of Red could be heard. And in this silence, Bruce Lee leaned close to the giant's ear. Do you expect him to hit him? Or to start bragging? Oh no. What Bruce whispered at that second made Elvis Presley himself jump off the couch, because those words were not about a fight. They were about the very essence of life and death. And at that moment, the king of rock and roll realized that standing before him was not just a martial arts master, but a man who saw the underside of this world. But are you ready to hear this phrase, which forever changed the relationship between the dragon and the king? The answer is already vibrating in the air, and it will destroy everything you knew about strength. The sound of a giant's ego collapsing is quieter than you can imagine. It is not a crash, but the barely audible, ragged exhale of a man who has just realized his entire life was built on sand. In the second Bruce Lee leaned toward Red's ear, a silence so thick descended upon the Las Vegas dressing room that you could hear the red-hot filaments of the stage spotlights cooling behind the wall. Do you expect the dragon to utter a threat, or to demand an apology? You're wrong. Bruce Lee whispered a phrase that hit Red harder than any knockout. Your strength is your prison, Red. You are so afraid of falling that you have already lost to gravity. There was no malice in these words. There was a frightening, almost divine detachment of a master who sees the world as a set of vectors and levers, not as an arena for ambition. And in that instant, what I call the Santa Barbara effect occurred. When the script of reality makes a sharp turn, Bruce Lee instantly, without a single unnecessary movement, released his fingers. The pressure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, and blood rushed back into Red's numb arm, bringing with it a wave of heat and tingling. But the giant continued to stand on one knee, not daring to raise his eyes. He felt naked. He realized that Bruce Lee hadn't just defended himself against his strike. He had looked into the very core of his being and found only fear, covered by a mountain of muscle. Do you think the other 4 bodyguards rushed to their leader's aid? No. They froze against the walls like wax figures. They had seen visual silence in action. They realized that if they took even a breath toward Bruce, they would end up in the same trap that Red had just escaped alive, only by the mercy of this man in the black suit. And here comes the moment of that very intellectual orgasm that puts everything in its place. Remember our dagger, that very white silk scarf of Elvis's lying on the table. While a drama of life and death played out in the center of the room, while a 200-pound athlete collapsed to the floor under the weight of his own ignorance, this scarf remained absolutely motionless. Imagine. A physical conflict occurred in the room. The air should have shuddered from sudden movements, but not a single fiber of the finest silk trembled. This was material proof that Bruce Lee controlled not only the opponent's body, but the very atmosphere in the room. He moved in the spaces between air molecules without creating a single vortex that could disturb the king's peace. Elvis Presley, who until that moment had sat in a daze, suddenly jumped off the couch. His face, usually hidden behind a mask of stage makeup and fatigue, was transformed. He wasn't in a rage because his best fighter had been humiliated. On the contrary, he was delighted. He saw what he had been looking for all those years he spent training in empty halls. He saw real magic. Elvis approached Bruce, and his hands, adorned with massive gold rings, trembled with excitement. "Bruce," he exhaled, and there was as much plea in his voice as there was admiration. "I'll give you any amount. Forget the movies. Become my personal mentor. Live at Graceland. Fly with me on my plane. Just teach me this silence. I want to know how you do it." This was the moment when doors to a world of limitless wealth and influence opened before Bruce Lee. To become the shadow of the most popular man on the planet, that meant forever forgetting about problems with film budgets and the racism of producers. Anyone else in his place would have seized this chance. But here occurs the final, most powerful turn of this part. Bruce Lee looked at Elvis, at this tired, lonely god in a golden cage, and there was no greed in his gaze. There was only deep compassion. Bruce slowly picked up that white scarf from the table, folded it neatly, and placed it in Elvis's hands. "Elvis," he said quietly, but so that every bodyguard by the wall heard him, "you are the king of your stage. The whole world sings your songs, but I cannot be your teacher, because I am the king of my own life, and kings do not serve other kings, even if their thrones are made of gold." A silence fell over the dressing room, so profound that you could hear water dripping in the sink. Elvis looked at the scarf in his hands, then at Bruce, and in that second, he realized a terrifying truth about himself and his mafia, a truth that would make him change his will that very night. But why did Bruce Lee's refusal become fatal for him, and what shadow from this hotel room haunted the dragon until his own mysterious death in Hong Kong? The real secret of this meeting is hidden not in the strikes, but in what Bruce saw in the mirror behind Elvis's back a second before walking out of the room. The twist you couldn't have predicted is already here, when Bruce Lee closed the heavy door of the presidential suite behind him, leaving a stunned Elvis and his defeated mafia behind. A silence reigned in the corridor of the International Hotel that was heavier than all the gold records in music history. You probably think the story ended there? The master left undefeated, and the king returned to his songs? That would be too simple, too linear for a finale, meant to overturn your consciousness. The real drama began the very second the echo of Bruce's footsteps faded, and Elvis Presley remained standing in the middle of the room, clutching that very white silk scarf, our plot Dagger, which now seemed to him not a symbol of fame, but a piece of a burial shroud. Why did Elvis's bodyguards keep silent about this meeting for almost 40 years? Do you think they were driven only by shame over a lost sparring session? Oh no, the reason was much darker. They realized that evening, Bruce Lee hadn't just put red on his knees, he had exposed the entire rot of their system, showing that their protection was merely an illusion and that their king was naked. And here, the Santa Barbara effect kicks in, which will make you freeze in surprise. That same night, after Bruce Lee vanished into the neon lights of Vegas, Elvis Presley did something his inner circle tried to hide for decades. He called his lawyer. He didn't want to sue Lee. He wanted to change his will, because the dragon's words that kings do not serve kings burned a hole in his soul that could not be filled with applause. Ask yourself honestly, what did Bruce Lee actually see in the mirror behind Elvis's back a second before leaving? This is the moment of our intellectual orgasm, when all the puzzle pieces fit into one frightening picture. Bruce didn't just see a tired singer. He saw a dead man, who was still walking. He smelled the medicine hidden behind the expensive perfume. He noticed Elvis's dilated pupils and that very emptiness in his eyes that belongs to people whose lives no longer belong to them. Bruce didn't refuse to be his teacher out of arrogance. He refused because he realized Elvis could no longer be saved by combat technique. He needed to be saved from himself, and that was a battle the dragon did not want to participate in. But here is a new question that haunts historians. Why did Bruce Lee himself become obsessed with the theme of the golden cage after this meeting? Do you think it's a coincidence that his last, unfinished film was titled Game of Death, where the hero ascends the floors of a tower, fighting giants? Remember Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, whom Bruce fights in the finale. Kareem was as tall as Elvis. He was an equally unreachable idol. Bruce Lee metaphorically transferred that Vegas meeting to the screen, trying to process the shock of how easily gods break. That very detail, the white scarf, was found among Elvis's personal belongings after his death in 1977. He had kept it for 5 years as a reminder of the only man who had the courage to say no to him. The irony of fate is that both of them, the dragon and the king, passed away young, leaving the world in a state of eternal mourning. But if Elvis died in his golden cage, buried under pills and fake love, Bruce Lee left in flight, at the peak of his freedom. And now, as we stand on the ruins of these two greatest legends of the 20th century, I want to ask you a question that will define your understanding of success. We all strive for the top. We all want recognition and power. But having looked at this meeting in Las Vegas, ask yourself, what is true strength? Is it being the king of the stage, like Elvis, having millions of fans, private planes, and an army of security, but being a hostage to your own image, without even the right to honest pain? Or is it being the king of your own life, like Bruce Lee, not having a tenth of that wealth, but possessing such internal silence that it makes giants fall to their knees without a single blow? Which path seems more worthy to you in the end? Whose side are you on in this debate about the price of greatness? The side of the shining but doomed throne, or the side of the free but lonely dragon? Write one word in the comments, Elvis or Bruce. I will be waiting for your answers, because in this choice lies the truth about whether you are ready to trade your comfort for your freedom. And did you notice at which minute I mentioned that the scarf was soaked in makeup? Write if you realized immediately that it was a mark of death. I will read every one of your comments,